School funding. Most people think that they understand completely how public schools and private schools are funded. Most people think that the federal government is the primary source for funding in our schools. That's not quite accurate. So let's take a look at how schools are in fact funded and how much each state spends on public education. Now, on the map in front of you, what you'll see is the public school spending per student. So, for instance, if you look at California, they're spending $12,700 per student. Now, if you look at Florida, they're spending $9,600 per student. You go to the District of Columbia, and they're spending $22,800 per student. In the state of New York, $23,300 per student. You'll suddenly realize that not every state is spending the same amount on students. You'll see a low of $7,500 all the way to that $23,300 in New York. Each state determines how much they will spend per pupil. Now let's take a look at how much of that funding comes from the federal government. You might be surprised at what you're seeing on the screen. For instance, in California, it's only $1,224 per student. In Florida, $1,206. In the District of Columbia, $2,354. And in New York, where you saw the per pupil spending at over $23,000, the federal government is only contributing $1,145 per student. And as you can see, there's a gap. Well, how is that gap funded? On the right of the screen, you'll see the averages from the United States. The federal government, on the average, only contributes 8% of the total per pupil expenses. States are funding 47%. Local property taxes are 36%, and other local sources. That could be anything from lotteries to a variety of different taxes. Now, if you look at the state of California, the state contributes 59% of all the funds that are allocated come from the state. The federal government is donating and contributing 8%. Local property taxes are 21%, and then other local sources are 12%. So as you can see, it is not just what is coming from the federal government. There are a lot of different sources for revenue. Now let's take a look at Michigan school funding. This breaks it down in a little bit more detail. Now, in this particular case, the federal funding allots for 11%. So they're getting slightly more because of the federal spending allocated to the state of Michigan. Now, how do they make up that other income? Well, as you see, sales and use tax, 43%. Income tax, 19%. Property taxes account for 14%. The lottery contributes 6%. And other sources are 7%. Again, different from what you saw in California. Now let's look at Fairfax County. Where do they get their funding? Well, as you can see there, the federal aid for Fairfax County only accounts for 1.5% of their budget. The city of Fairfax contributes 1.6%. They have a reserve fund, which allocates 0.1%. County transfer tax, 71.3%. State aid, 16.6%. So again, you'll see different locations, even within a state, are funded slightly differently. Now here's Louisiana schools. As you see, 13% in Louisiana is coming from the federal government. The state is contributing 44%, and the local communities are contributing 43%. Again, you'll need to remember that local taxes are accounting for 43% of the money that's coming in to fund education in the state of Louisiana. Now, let's look at New York City schools. Where does their $32.3 billion budget comes from? 37% comes from New York State, from the state itself. Only 6% is coming from the federal government, and 57% is coming from New York City. That means it's coming from the tax base in New York City. It's really important to remember that each jurisdiction has its own funding sources. Now, we've been talking about public schools. Well, how are private schools, independent schools, funded? Well, their money comes from tuition, grants, endowments, development, which again is another name for concentrated and specific fundraising activities. Now, tuition actually accounts for the majority of the monies. But without those grants, endowments, and the fundraising activities, those development activities, private schools would not be able to stay in business. So again, when you're looking at school funding, you look at the public school model where you are getting funding from the state, you're getting money from the federal government. In the private schools, that really doesn't happen. It's coming from tuition, grants. Now, some of those grants might be federal grants or state grants, but there is no requirement as you would have with a public school, and endowments and development activities. So it's critical in the private schools that they are constantly aware of the cost of tuition and student enrollment, which will dictate what they will be able to spend both on salaries and instructional and facilities in their schools. I hope this brief presentation gives you a clear idea about schools and how they're funded.